All right, um, welcome everybody. So today we are going to look at housing market in Singapore. So first and foremost, the housing market in Singapore is made of three segments. First, you have the BTO segment, which includes what we call SBF or sale of balance flats. These are the flats that are left over from the previous BTO exercises or from en bloc SERS, selective en bloc redevelopment scheme leftover units that were unsold. But they don't amount to a lot. Okay, so basically BTO flats are the newly built flats by HDB and put up for sale. Right, then the second segment of the market is called the HDB resale market. So these are people who have bought HDB and then they are selling it as a second-hand flat. And the third and last segment of the market is the private property market, which includes basically all your private residential property, including private apartments, condos, and your landed property as well. Right, so these are the various three main areas of the market. All right, so let's now move on to, let me get my cursor to the right place. All right, so under the BTO market, right, how the diagram looks like, right, is that you will have what is called a vertical supply curve. The reason why you have a vertical supply curve, right, is because the HDB, in terms of its planning horizon, right, takes into account demographic changes, marriages, as well as people reaching of certain age. So we take into account the population changes that leads to a certain expectation of demand. So then on a quarterly basis, they project what is the amount of HDB flats to put up for available sale for BTO flats. So on a quarterly basis, they determine a certain number. So there's a vertical supply curve in the sense that whether you pay higher price or lower price, HDB is not going to change the number of units available within each quarter. Now then the demand curve, right, is basically your normal downward sloping demand curve, which is people who want to buy BTO flats. Now, of course, who gets to buy BTO flats, right, is there are certain eligibility requirements that needs to be fulfilled before people can buy the HDB flats. So like for example, you need to be of a certain age group, you need to be married if you are below 35 years old, etc. Right, so under these conditions, right, then you have people who can buy, who have be on the demand curve. Now on top of that, right, the HDB sets a fixed price below market price to ensure that property housing is affordable for all. So if you look at the diagram now, right, by setting the price below equilibrium price, this creates a shortage in the market. So what happens to this shortage is that we need to deal with the shortage in terms of who gets to buy, who doesn't get to buy, right? So what we need to do is to decide how to allocate. So the way to allocate, right, in HDB will be through balloting, for example. So the government will say, okay, those who qualify will bid for it. In each bidding exercise, there are usually about 3 bidding exercises a year. I think February once, June once, and I think October once, right, or September, October once. So during the balloting exercise, they will see who is lucky and get it, and who doesn't get lucky then can try again in the next bidding exercise. But suppose, right, if you don't want to wait, or you can't afford to wait, you urgently need to get a new property, right, then what you can do is to spill over to the new the secondary market, which is the HDB resale market, or you can also go to the private property market. So this is called the spillover to the HDB resale market or private property market. Right, so those who cannot get BTO can turn to resale flat, right, and resale flats, of course, will be transacted at market prices. All right, so let's look at what is the resale flat market. How does it function? In the resale flat, right, hang on, let me scroll up here. All right, so in the resale flat, the pricing is determined purely by market forces. So demand and supply determine market prices. So in the sense that HDB doesn't actually step in to intervene by imposing any form of price control. However, that doesn't mean that the HDB does not intervene in the market. The HDB does in fact intervene in the resale market. How does it intervene? The way HDB intervene in the resale market, right, is by setting certain eligibility criterion. Like for example, you have to be maybe citizens, you have to be permanent residents, if you are downgraders from private property, you have a minimum wait out period for 15 months, etc. So there are certain criteria you must fulfill, right? Second, there is also subsidies. There are also grants for what we call first-time buyers, who gets to buy resale flat at a cheaper price. So there is intervention, just that the prices of this the prices of the resale HDB flat, right, are not controlled by HDB. They are simply just controlled by market forces. Alright, so this is the resale HDB market. Kind of difficult to find my cursor when I have 3 screens. There you are. Alright, so in the resale market, what will happen is that the demand supply will intersect. So when the government gives subsidies, right, to some people, in terms of the grants, right, these grants are direct subsidies given to first-time buyers. So first-time buyers now have added purchasing power. So the subsidies are actually adding to demand that drive the demand up. The willingness and ability to pay by first-time buyers is higher. Right, so eligibility criteria is what disallows some people to even enter the market. So this is how the resale market actually functions. Alright, next, the private residential property market is basically then purely a free market entity, right? So in the private property market, there is absolutely no government intervention in terms of the pricing of the housing is concerned. There are some limited eligibility criterion where the government restrict, let's say for example, foreigners, right, are not allowed to buy landed property, with the exception of Sentosa Cove, right, and there are no government grants whatsoever. But there are loan to valuation limits. That means there are credit controls that limit people's ability to borrow money regardless of nationality, right? So these are your 3 different markets in the housing market in Singapore. You have 3 subsegments: the BTO market, the HDB resale market, and the private property market. So what you see here, right, is a table, right, to show the comparison across the 3 markets, where you can see under BTO, under resale, under private property, you can look at price mechanism. So like BTO is administrative pricing, means the HDB decides on the price, whereas HDB resale and private property, the market forces of demand supply determine the price. Now again, I remind you, it's not that it is a complete free market. The government does intervene, especially in the HDB resale market, right? So this information here you can see. For those of you who are my students, I will also upload a PDF version of these slides, right, onto the Telegram, so you can also refer to this information without having to like screenshot off the YouTube screen. Alright, okay, so this is the HDB resale market. So next, let's move on to the next slide. Now the next slide, what we want to do, right, is I want to look at a particular essay question review. This is a essay question from the A-level exam 2017 question. So this question, right, was about residential property price inflation. If you can see from the preamble of this question, there was a rapid residential property price inflation in Singapore. The question asks you to discuss policies, part B, discuss policies that might be used by the Singapore government to reduce residential property price inflation. I think a lot of students, when they deal with this question, right, they have a misconception in that they don't understand the property market is made up of 3 segments. So they try to talk about, oh, let's build more HDB, and then their understanding is, if I build more HDB, supply increase, price will fall, right? But remember, HDB prices, right, are not based on market forces. HDB prices are controlled by the government. So for there to be a rapid residential property price inflation, right, this necessarily refers to the private property market, right, or the HDB resale market. right? It cannot be talking about BTO market. So the way we use this BTO, building more BTO flats, for example, to help ease the private property market or the resale market prices, right, has to be analyzed a little differently. So take note for this question in 2017, the way to analyze must be in terms of either the private property market or the resale HDB market or both, right? So even in the part A of this question, right, when you're asked to explain how the events here, the falling interest rate and rising income growth may have led to rapid rise in private property, that cannot be referring to the BTO prices, right? That should be referring only to the HDB resale and private property. Alright, so let's look at how to answer this question. So we need to present certain policies. For part B of this question, I'm focusing primarily on part B. Discuss policies that can be used. So we can classify policies into supply side policies or demand side policies. So the key policy I want to focus on first, right, is the increase in the flat supply for BTO. So the government, remember, every quarter they have a planning horizon to decide how many units of property they want to release into the market. So for instance, right, if the government, let me scroll up to this policy. So when the government increases the supply of private property, right, so what will happen, supply of HDB flats, right, so what this does is to increase the number of new BTO flats built. With an increase in number of BTO flats built, right, then what happens here is that the shortage becomes smaller. Now remember what happens to the shortage. When there's a shortage, right, people ballot for the units. Not everybody gets those units, right? Those who don't get, some of them will try again in the next ballot, right? Some of them will spill over to the resale market or private property market. So some of these people who are who couldn't get, right, will be contributing to the demand for the resale flat. So if the shortage has gotten smaller, then the effect of this, right, is actually to lower the demand for resale flat as well as the demand for private property. This will lead to a lowering of the prices or easing the property price inflation in these markets. So this will be how you explain the policy of building more HDB flat. So that's the way you present this. Now looking at another supply side policy, the government can use is what we call government land sales. So what government land sales does, right, is when the government increases the amount of land that government releases each cycle. So usually a year, right, government releases land like 2 times, right, once in February, once in July usually, right, where they will release extra land for private residential property development, right? So then in the land market, an increase in the supply with more land being released for private property development, this will cause the price to fall. Take note that this is not just only for private condos, this also includes for ECs, right? So with a lowering of the price of land, so this is the land market, right, residential land market. So with land prices falling, the cost of producing residential properties decrease, then this will contribute to a fall in the prices or easing of the inflationary pressures in the property market, right? So this is what can be done in the property market in terms of supply side policies. All right, so other than the supply side policies, what other policies can the government use? Okay, hang on, I have a question here. So if we say build more private property or put out more for sale, will that work? Are you saying I think this is Justin, right? Are you saying that we are asking the government to build more private property, right? The government wouldn't be building private property, right? So this will be, private property will be more about building private property will be more in terms of the private developers. So the government just releases more land. So the government isn't the one building, Justin. Alright, so continuing. Now, what are some demand side policies? So there's this policy known as the ABSD, or Additional Buyer Stamp Duty. What the ABSD does, right, is to try to restrict people from buying additional properties, especially if you are Singapore citizens, right, or PRs, right. When you buy your first property, there is no additional buyer stamp duty. So the additional buyer stamp duty only applies for second property onwards. The reason why we want to apply only for second property onwards is because we don't want to have this policy discourage home ownership, right? We also encourage home ownership in the country. Just that if everybody wanted to buy a second property or third property, right, then the market couldn't support everybody's aspiration to own multiple homes, then this will translate into over too high a demand and rising property prices, and will make the younger generation, right, more and more difficult to become homeowners. So then, in order to balance the interest of the next generation as well as the aspiration of the current generation to own more property, the government have to ration and say, okay, well, if you wish to buy a additional property, then you have to be prepared to pay a lot more taxes, right, to be able to do that, right? So, and to give preferential treatment to citizens and PRs, right, foreigners, right, have to pay ABSD even from the first property that they buy, and the percentages that the PRs have to pay for the second property is also higher than citizens. So the government has a priority system, right, that prioritizes the locals more than the foreigners, and the citizens more than the PRs. All right. In my last slide, I says, where is it? Hang on, what are you talking about? You mean the government land sales, right? Here when we say pipeline, it's not talking about pipes. Pipeline means that basically a supply, right? Basically, in more land supplied to the development of private properties and ECs. So basically, the government is providing more, putting up more land available. So let's say for a particular, this half of the year, the government initially had planned to put out so many land parcels to build private property, but seeing that property prices are rising rapidly in the private sector, in the private property market, the government may choose to change their plans and say, okay, we're going to put out more land parcels this next half a year. Then with a greater supply of land, then this lowers the price of land, and then with the lower price of land, this lower price will pass through back to the consumers ultimately by having a supply for private property increase, right? So imagine more developers may get the land, then they compete with each other to lower the price. Now, of course, you can discuss to what extent will the lower cost be passed on to the consumers, looking at various factors like elasticities, etc., can be discussed further in terms of the effectiveness of the policy. All right, I hope that answers your question. All right, so going back to ABSD, so the ABSD is basically a policy aimed at trying to curtail what we call investment demand, right? So this is trying to curtail what we call investment demand. Does it affect speculative demand? Not so much, right? Speculative demand and investment demand is slightly different. Investment demand refers to like when people buy property, right, for the sake of renting out and generating a stream of rental income. So they intend to buy and hold on to the property for a longer term. However, speculative demand, right, is what some of you may understand from the West, right, is this thing called flipping of houses. So when people buy property, right, they buy it with the intention to sell it off quickly when the house price appreciate. So imagine, right, if I buy a property and the current price of this private condo is like $1 million, for instance, and then maybe 6 months down the road, right, the property becomes like $1.3 million. Then by selling it off in 3 months, right, I'm able to make a difference of $300,000. That $300,000 is called a capital gain by the homeowner, for the owner of the home, right? So So Justin, you say like housing investment. So buying a property for rental is like investment asset, right? Generating rental income. But flipping is different. Flipping is when when a person buys a property and hoping for capital gain. It's like you buy shares and you hope that the share price go up and then you sell it for a higher price. So you now buy a property for $1 million, you hope it goes up to 1.2, 1.3 million, you sell it off, you make the difference of $200,000 to $300,000, right? Now then the government says, well, I'm going to tax you additional amount of money of 20%, right, to buy second property. So does it curb speculative demand? To some extent it does, right? But at the end of the day, it's targeted at people owning second home or third homes or onwards. Now what really targets speculative demand, right, is actually this thing called the SSD. The SSD is something that curtails speculative demand. What it does is it imposes a very high tax on people when they buy a house and sell it within a span of 3 years. So if you buy a property and you sell it like within a year, you pay a very high tax. You sell it within after a year but before 2 years, you pay a lower tax. You sell it after 2 years but before the end of the third year, you pay even lower tax. But if you sell it after owning the property for 3 years, then SSD doesn't apply anymore. So the way this policy is designed, right, is such that it's trying to get people, right, to not sell their houses quickly. Then who would buy a house with the intention of selling quickly? Only the speculators, right? Somebody who is buying a home to stay, right, isn't likely to buy a house and sell it off quickly within 3 years. Somebody who buy a house as an investment asset who wants to generate rental income isn't likely going to sell away the house within a short span of time as well. So this policy is really targeting speculative demand. So both ABSD and SDSD, right, are policies aimed at decreasing the demand for private property. Right, so this is for private property development. We are trying to decrease that. Alright, now in addition to ABSD and SSD, there are also other policies like mortgage servicing ratio. This one pertains to HDB and executive condo, so it limits the amount of loans people can get such that the loan repayment cannot be more than 30% of your monthly gross income, right? Otherwise you are not allowed to buy such an expensive house. So this is more to I guess it's less partially to lower demand to curtail the demand pool inflation in property, but also to ensure that people don't run into financial distress, right, by buying a house that they cannot afford, right? Now, then this 15-month wait out rule for private property downgraders is a policy aimed at trying to slow down the re-entry from private property back to HDB. So there's a rule in Singapore that if you own a private property, you cannot buy HDB, right? So, but if you sell your private property, then you can re-enter the HDB market. But you see, the problem is when people sell their private property, right, they cash out a private property from a private property with a large sum of money, then they can easily, right, buy a resale HDB flat and push up the market price by a lot. So in order to prevent this group, right, from overly flooding the demand in the HDB resale market to push prices too high, then the government imposed a 15-month wait out rule. There's some talk by our new minister who is thinking that they will consider maybe just changing this 15-month rule, shortening it, or maybe even removing it. You can see that that's because, right, if the property prices are not rising sharply, there's not much inflation, then the 15-month wait out period, right, is not necessary to maintain anymore, or don't have to maintain for so long. So this is really just a policy aimed at moderating demand in the short term. All right. So with that, right, so these are the various policies. Now, what I have here, right, is a page that shows you the policy limitations as well, in terms of what kind of limitation that ABSD will have, what kind of limitation SSDs will have, loan to valuation limits, which is really like your MSR thing just now that we saw. Loan to valuation limits pertains to private property as well. So when you borrow money to pay to borrow money to buy a house, for instance, your loan amount will translate into a monthly mortgage amount. If your monthly mortgage amount exceeds a certain percentage of your income, then you're not allowed to take that loan in the first place. So that also serves to dampen demand, right? TDSR is something similar, total debt servicing ratio. If you want to know more about it, please go and read up about this, Google this, or maybe if there's an opportunity, I'll do a video on YouTube or TikTok about what exactly is TDSR. But it's something you can easily find out, right? So, but do learn about the limitations of these policies and how we can use these limitations in our exams to answer the question. All right, so then going back to the essay question here, just a little bit of pointers for you. So for this essay question, right, part B is a policy discussion question. So how would you answer this? So we recommend that what you do is you have a main body, right, and a conclusion. Right, inside your main body, then just present two policies, given the exam time requirement is only 50 minutes for the whole essay, and part A taking about 20 minutes, so you only have about 30 minutes left for part B, so you bring about two policies to be sufficient. Within each policy, what you should do is to have a thesis paragraph and an antithesis paragraph explaining how the policy works and explaining a limitation of the policy. So what you should do, choose two policies, preferably with scope, so one demand side, one supply side will be ideal. Then from there, each policy present a T and an A paragraph, thesis and antithesis paragraph. And then what you do is you present a IEV, right? IEV, what your school calls the interim evaluation. So basically assessing each policy in terms of its own merits, right? And then after you have finished that, then you do your overall EV, right, where you compare the two policies you have presented to see which policy is the best policy to use, or you could propose the first policy is better, second policy is better, or you can even propose the combination of policy is better. So what you need to do is to present your overall stand on what's the best policy, plus you must justify, right? So exactly how to write these T paragraphs, A paragraphs, IEV paragraphs, exactly how to structure the overall EV paragraphs, then these are stuff that we will cover in our regular classes. So any one of you who is not our student and interested to learn how to write those paragraphs, then please feel free to join our tuition class and come to us for a free trial lesson, and then we will be able to provide you with an experience to see how we answer different question types. All right, so then this will be the end of it. Okay, so from now I will answer questions. If you have any, please feel free to key into the comments page if you've got any questions. Oh yeah, like, subscribe, hit the bell and share, please. Gerald asks, by house flipping, wait I cannot see my whole message screen, give me a moment, Gerald. May I ask, by house flipping the whole housing land price increase, how does it usually plummet very fast after sharp inflation? Doesn't work quite like this, Gerald. So when people flip houses, right, so some people will see the house prices rising. They say, oh, you know, if house prices are rising, they expect it to continue to rise. So by buying the house, I'm hoping that when I buy at a certain price, it will rise, I can sell it off later. But because of my expectation, I add to the demand. So my action of adding to demand actually ultimately increase the price further. Right, so if enough people think like me, then everybody starts buying. So then this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where speculation for that house prices are rise cause people to speculate on houses, buy more property. And if there's no government control on how much property people can buy, then people will take out a lot of loans, buy a lot of property, and that drives prices up. Now then, as prices rise and rise and rise, right, then there comes a point, right, that the prices become unsustainable. It's too high, right, for the ordinary folk, right, or to have for enough ordinary folk to have the purchasing power to buy those property. Then the house prices will become too unsustainable. Now, of course, this will not immediately crash the market just yet. What will happen usually, right, is then people will find ways, right, to get credit, right, to squeeze out more credit to be able to continue borrowing money. With modern day borrowing money from overseas bank becomes so easy, right? You can easily finance property purchase from multiple different loan sources. Again, if your government doesn't have any restriction on this. Now, then as the house prices increase, then property developers, right, seeing these higher prices, right, it's going to respond, right, based on law of supply, right, higher prices, I'll build more, right. So all this while the builders are building more, the buyers are buying more, but they are buying based on speculative demand, so they're not really going to stay in these houses. Now, at some point, right, maybe a few years down the road, you will have an excess supply of private property being built. There'll be more houses than there are people to stay in them. And the moment people start to realize that, wait a minute, we have far too many houses in the market, then you have a realization of excess supply already. Then the expectation will start to form that prices will start to fall. Then somebody will start to sell first, right? As a group of people start selling first, the prices start rising more slowly. And then those observant people will notice that prices are rising more slowly. They think maybe the party is ending, so we need to quickly let go of our property. So as more people sell, then the prices will plateau. Eventually the prices starts to turn the curve and started to fall. Once the prices start to fall, then more and more people notice this, then people start rushing to sell, and that will begin the process of the property market crashing. That's usually how it happens. If you look at many property bubble bursting in many different parts of the world. In fact, not just property bubble, like a lot of different kind of bubbles burst in a similar fashion. But property tends to work through this process. Right, so Gerald, I hope that helps you. For year sixes, this will be especially useful to know what I just explained in terms of globalization. One of the harmful effects of globalization is that hot money or capital flows, right, are so free across international borders that they fuel asset bubble inflation, right? So property bubbles tend to grow really rapidly because funding for private credit is very easy to acquire in the when the global financial markets, right, are so free to move capital around. Okay, so I have another question from Cadence. Since the question didn't state, then can you use any of the FEAST to evaluate the policies? Alright, so for those of you who don't know what is FEAST, right, FEAST stand for feasibility, effectiveness, appropriateness, side effects, and time lags. This refer to the different types of limitations. So the question says, discuss the policies that might be used by the Singapore government to reduce the residential property price inflation. Yes, Cadence, you're right, it did not say discuss the policies that might be used effectively, right? So you could argue antithesis says, oh, this might be a policy that works, but however, it can create some unwanted side effects, right? Unintended consequences. So like for instance, in Shanghai, for instance, right, many years ago, around 12, 13 years ago, the city government of Shanghai decided to pass a new rule to curb investment demand and speculative demand by saying that every family, right, every household is only allowed to buy one property. So then that's a very hard rule, right? You can't change the rule, right? But what was unanticipated, right, was that divorce rates started to climb in Shanghai when families, right, couples, right, started to divorce, right, on paper, so that they turn one family into two families, right, so they can qualify to buy two properties. So that will certainly be an unintended consequence. I think when the city council decided to come out with this rule, they certainly did not hope that people will go into divorce. All right, JTZ, I don't know who you are, but can I suggest that the government reduce stamp duty for resale and private property? If the government were to reduce stamp duty for resale and private property, right, then that would actually push the demand for private property and resale property higher. Why would you want to do that? Right, the goal of this question is to reduce the property price inflation. So all this stamp duty, right, which is your ABSD, right, is something to, or SSD, they are there to dampen demand. So if you want to reduce them, right, then you're actually pushing demand up again. So no, you wouldn't want to suggest this as a way to deal with the property price inflation. You mean increase? Yes, you can suggest the government increase it. Yes, of course. Wow, that was a very dangerous typo, JTZ. to reduce when you mean to increase. Costly as well, I believe, in the exam. All right, do we have any more questions from anyone else? Pretty great. There's no lagging today, right? My screen is not freezing. Yeah. Then must I explain what is stamp duty or no need? Of course you have to, right? Of course you have to. If you're going to propose a change in the stamp duty and increase in the stamp duty, then you're going to have to explain what is it and how it works first, right? But to be fair, right, you can also pretend that there is no additional buyer stamp duty to begin with, and you're just, introducing stamp duty as a policy that you are proposing. But actually, you don't even have to introduce as proposed. The question says what policies might be used by the government. You can say that, one of the policies that Singapore government can use and in fact has used is the introduction of this thing called the ABSD. Right, so they don't even, the question doesn't even restrict you from choosing existing policy. So you don't have to come up with something new. Would this stamp duty be effective in Singapore where everyone becomes more wealthy and this increase would not really affect people? I guess, but Justin, you can then raise it. So setting it at the right level, right, should be able to limit the demand effectively. So basically, it's about adjusting the level, right, to moderate the level of demand. Right, so if you imagine you put the stamp duty as 2%, additional buyer stamp duty as 2% or 3%, right, then it's not going to discourage anybody, right, because 2 or 3% is too small an amount to dampen demand. So the government, might have put up 7% at first, or then eventually raised to 13%, right. Over the years they've been raising, right. Now, right, at the moment Singapore citizens are buying the second property, the ABSD already stands at 20%, right. And third property is at 30%. 30% of buying price, right? So if you buy a second property that's worth $1 million, right? Private property that's worth $1 million, then the ABSD alone, right, is $200,000, right? So if you're telling me that as people get wealthier and this $200,000 is no longer enough to curtail demand, right? Then maybe they raise it up to 30%, right? Or 35% even. So what you're saying is imperfect information, perhaps, right? Maybe the government initially suffered from imperfect information and isn't aware what is the right percentage to set. And I think that's fair, right? That's fair. And the evaluation of this point is that governments don't know, right, for a fact how much is the right percentage to set. But that's the beauty of government policies, right? They can adjust, right? So what they can do is they set a tax. If they realize that, I think it's too low, right? It's not sufficient to dampen demand. So they can adjust it, right? In the policy review, maybe 3 to 6 6 months down the road or a year down the road, they may raise the percentages. Or sometimes if the property price inflation is quite rapid, right, they can even review 1 month down the road and say, oh, 7% isn't enough, let's go up to 12%. Then later on, another 2 weeks later, 12% isn't enough, let's go up to 20%. So over time, the government can adjust. And for example, if they set it too high, right, they could also have a policy review and bring it down. So imperfect information on the part of the government isn't ultimately a critical problem, as long as the government does a periodic review to adjust the rates down to a reasonable level that achieves their goals. Okay, Justin, I hope that answers your question. So actually, the property market in Singapore is quite an interesting market to look at. There are many more markets we're going to look at over the course of the next many weeks, right? So like for example, another one that will be coming up at some point will be healthcare market in Singapore, about healthcare provision, healthcare financing. That will be a very, very big market that we need to look at. Another one I want to talk about will be the water market in Singapore or utilities market in Singapore, right? And then public transport, another big market to talk about as well. Right, Josh has a question. What would happen if HDB set a price ceiling rather than fixed price for BTOs? Josh, this is a very common mistake that a lot of people make. You think about what is the meaning of price ceiling? Price ceiling, right, is a legally mandated maximum price that a seller is allowed to set. So who sets the price ceiling? The government sets the price ceiling, right? Who has to abide by this price ceiling? The seller has to abide by this price ceiling. If the seller was some private firm, right, and says that I want to sell at my profit maximizing price, and then the government says, no, you're not allowed to because I have set the price ceiling. You can only sell it at this price or lower, cannot sell higher, right? That makes sense, right? But wait, who's selling BTO flats? The only seller of BTO flats is the government, right? Then what? The government, HDB is telling HDB, hey, HDB, you're not allowed to sell below this price. You're not sell above this price. You can only sell below. Then HDB is like, oh, but I want to. Doesn't make sense, right? I'm not. If I'm HDB, I'm not going to impose a price ceiling on myself. I decide what price to set. I will set the price that I deem is at a reasonable rate that is affordable for everybody, right? So the whole notion of calling this a price ceiling, right, totally don't make sense at all. Okay? But thanks for asking that though, because this is a super common mistake I see a lot of students make, and they will label this administrative pricing by HDB as a price ceiling. Okay, so just everybody take note, don't ever call this a price ceiling. It's a fixed price. Or to use the terms of HDB is administrative pricing. Right, do I have any more questions coming up? Okay, I believe that this is it then. So if there's no other questions, then we will end the stream here. If you have any more follow-up questions, please feel free to type into the chat window, type into the chat. I will continue to respond there, or if you prefer, you can always text me. Oh, I got one more question coming in. Cadence asks, so if it's any industry that's under the government, then it should be the price and not the fixed price, not price ceiling. Okay, let me rephrase this clearly. Cadence, not say it's under the government. So if the government is the seller, is the sole seller of a good, right? If the government is the sole seller of the good, then it will be treated as the fixed price, right? It's kind of weird to the government to impose a price ceiling on itself. Like for example, like PUB sell pipe water to our house, right, at a fixed price, right? It wouldn't be a price ceiling, right? So uh, yeah, so our bus fares right now, bus fares, fixed bus fares, right, for certain journeys, for certain distance travel, there's a fixed bus fare for each each class of distance travel. That's a fixed price. That's not a price ceiling. That's not a price ceiling. So if the government is a sole seller, then it will not be called price ceiling. It will be just weird to call it a price ceiling. Okay, then we shall call it a day. Thank you very much for your time, everybody. Let's look forward to next week, and we will pick up another topic, another set of policies. I'm open to suggestions. Anybody wants me to focus on a specific type of policy or specific segment of the policies in Singapore, please text me and let me know. Then I'll see which policy has more demand, right? Then I'll supply that. Okay, thank you.